Hello and welcome to another episode of the djproject Criterion Collection. And here we're going to talk about Spine 408, Breathless, directed by Jean-Luc Godard, 1960. This along with The 400 Blows and to some extent Hiroshima Mon Amour are considered the films that helped launch the new wave. And Breathless stuck out in particular with its its kind of devil-may-care attitude towards pretty much anything and everything. Its frenetic jump cut editing, and a film where it runs the cultural gambit of quoting movies to quoting William Faulkner. And in reviewing this again, I can't help but think of this as perhaps the most successful, well-known cult film. And similarly, I can also see this as the most successful experimental film. Because there's nothing really about the film itself that screams, "I am popular." There was no drawing attention to itself. It almost came onto the scene and it became its own thing. I think much in the same way that Easy Rider was for in the U.S., where it was a film where there weren't a lot of high expectations, but it just hit a nerve. And particularly with the youth, and then suddenly became this big thing. This is probably a nice way to say that I feel kind of ambivalent. Not necessarily, again, I don't think that it's a bad film or at all. It's just, I think I've, maybe doing these, I'm sort of bogged down with reviewing over 100 films, and maybe it's the monotony of just going through all of that. Or maybe it's figuring out what I like about Godard, and maybe that's just it. But Breathless doesn't feel that... I mean, I understood why it was popular. I understood why it was instantly revered. But there's... I don't know. I just feel an ambivalence. And I think it's mostly just because I've been doing these reviews, and I'm getting to a point where I feel a bit oversaturated with watching films. But I'm going to plow on anyway, and who knows, maybe I'll kind of get it back. So, but it doesn't mean that I excuse me, can't find anything positive to say about it. It's just that I think in general it's not my favorite of Godard's films. Again, my personal favorite would be Contempt, and then also Woman is a Woman. But unfortunately, those two are out of print. This one you can get. This is not a problem to obtain. But anyways, the film is significant for two big things. One, it sets pretty much from the beginning what Godard was all about. And this is why I call it the least likely, or I think of this as like the least likely to be a popular film, because again, there was nothing about it that just screams "I am popular." This is through and through a film that Godard wanted to make. He wanted to take advantage of what was available to him, what he wanted to do, and it just it sort of became his own thing. And the film itself, it really does. This is why I certainly recommend it as a really good introduction to Godard, because it does lay out everything that Godard is about, particularly about just basically doing whatever the hell he wants. And similarly, I mean, the story itself, maybe this is why I feel a little bit of ambivalence to it, because the story itself is a pretty straightforward crime narrative. The central character, Michel, played by Jean-Paul Belmondo, and this was the film that really started his career as an actor. He's a petty criminal, and in fact, his big thing is stealing cars, and he steals this one car in in South France, and he drives up, and en route to Paris, he dodges the police. The police come by, and he actually shoots an officer dead, and then proceeds to go on in Paris. And then there's a chase after it. So it's a combination of him trying to avoid the police, trying to obtain some money and get some quick flings, including with his American girlfriend, Patricia, played by Jean Seberg, which wasn't her first film, but this was the film that made her famous and certainly made her recognizable. She actually got a more dramatic, and then she had a famous and then later turned infamous start by being cast by Otto Preminger to be in the film Saint Joan, which ended up being a disaster financially and critically, even though it was based on a George Bernard Shaw play, and it was Otto Preminger, and he made this big deal out of the casting. And then Jean Seberg was from Iowa, was ended up being cast for the role, and she also appeared in another Preminger film, and she also got escaped. But this was the film that kind of made her career, and arguably probably the high point of her career. Her when you get into her story, it's kind of sad about what happened to her. And in fact, there's a moment. Well, Patricia, the big trademark with her that you get from her in the film is that she sells New York Herald Tribune in the Champs-Elysees. She walks up and down and says, "New York Herald Tribune," and she has aspirations to become a reporter. And at a certain point, she interviews this novelist who's played by Jean-Pierre Melville. And the question that really gets his attention, she asks it the first time and he ignores it, but then she asks it again later at the end, and she gets a successful answer. She asks, "What's your greatest ambition in life?" And he answers, "To become immortal and then die." And it's one of those after-the-fact things when you consider what happened to her. In a way, she has, by being in this film and being in this well-known film, she's become immortal, and then, although this would be much later on, she would die. And again, it's, if you read and hear about her story, it's really, really sad. Come to think of it. But at any rate, back to the film. So the film definitely establishes what Godard is all about, which, and also by extension, it also proves that you can take any basic storyline or any basic film genre convention. And again, the story itself is a pretty straightforward crime narrative. You can take that and you can infuse it with whatever you want, and you can totally make it your own. And that is what makes Godard. And that's what makes him, whether you like him or you hate him, you have to admire that kind of personal investment he made in continues to make in his films, but certainly most spectacularly in the 1960s, beginning with Breathless. And so, if he wants to, pretty much the only reason why you have Patricia reading a bit of William Faulkner, and it's the line, "If between nothing and grief, I choose grief." It's for really no other reason other than he likes it. He likes Faulkner. He wants to put it in the film. Whatever kind of quotes he wants to put, whatever kind of jokes or little nods and winks, any of that, it's all because he wants to. And I've seemed to somewhat start this thing a little bit more recently of talking about current directors standing on the shoulders of past directors or admiring past directors. In this case, you can definitely, it's obvious with Breathless. It's certainly obvious with Band of Outsiders, but you can tell that Tarantino really liked Godard, and which again is kind of an interesting cue to take, considering that, like I said, it's an unusual film to be just suddenly popular, but it did, and I think it's just because of that energy and that youth appeal, and I think also that to some extent it was just, let's just try something. There was no calculation. There was hardly any calculation. There was it's not to say that it wasn't planned or that there wasn't some thought put into it. It's that it had this. It's often compared to jazz, and for good reason. It has the feeling of a jazz performance where there's a little bit of a structure. There's some bounds, but really it's just a matter of picking the right people to make this all happen. Picking Jean-Paul Belmondo, picking Sean Seberg, having Raoul Cotard shoot the film with relatively lightweight Aeroflex cameras that allowed for more freedom. One, more freedom of movement, and two, the ability to shoot on locations. And I think that's one of the big takeaways that you can get from Breathless is and this is why this film is considered one of those demarcation points in cinema history, the films that come before and the films that come after. Which is interesting because Breathless, like several of the Nouvelle Vague films, owe a lot to Italian neorealism, which also utilized actual locations. But here there's a little bit of an energy to it, and it's not as formal as compared to Italian neorealism. Even in spite of the ties to, or the evocation of anything that's the ties with realism, or the evocation of realism, it's still bound by some bit of formalism. It follows more or less conventional cinema. It just broadens the palette a little bit. Instead of confining it to a studio, you bring it all out in the open. But this one takes it even a little bit further than the Italian neorealists did. So, but yeah, as I'm sure I said in the other Godard films that I reviewed, Breathless really is a really good introduction to Godard. If you want to know what the hell he's all about, why people who really get into film talk about him, that it is the film to go to. It's certainly one of the easiest films to get into. That and Band of Outsiders. It's reference heavy. Yes, there's a lot of layers and so forth. But it's not as overbearing as some of his other films. And it's certainly there's another Godard film that's coming very soon into the pipeline. And it's not, while it's radical in its own right, it's not overtly radical as some of his later films would be. So, and I guess the final thought is, you usually see it as Breathless, but you see the French title, it's Bout, souffle. Bout du souffle. I probably still botched the French, pardonnez-moi. And you wonder, like, okay, is this one of those funky? Well, literally, the French title literally translates to "at breath's end," or it's understood as "out of breath," and so hence you get Breathless. So again, this is my review. I'm going to inject whatever kind of references I want. I'm following Godard's cue, so I'm just not going to do jump cuts in there. But anyways. Breathless. And until next time, take care.